No. Wait. Elon Musk, I can't speak to you right now. Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast
there's this economist named Daniel Kahneman who's written extensively, Nobel Prize winner, written extensively about how people make decisions. And one of the formulations that he's well known for is called the peak end rule. And the peak end rule says that when people go through an experience and they look back at it in order to formulate a decision, that basically they only remember two things, or only take into account two primary factors in decision making, which is the peak event in that process and the last contact.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's show. On today's show we have Andy Paul, a fellow podcaster, and we're diving into how to improve the quality of the touches and the value that you can add to each prospect with each touch as you go through the buying process. It is really cool, really counterintuitive, some of the things that Andy comes out with, and I think this is a real good show, and I wish I would have known some of this 5 years ago when I was in the midst of my medical device sales career. You can find out more about Andy over at andypaul.com. He's got an excellent podcast, more for the sales leadership side of things, which might be applicable for some of you guys listening. That's called Accelerate with an exclamation mark. You can find that on iTunes. And with that all said, let's jump into today's show. Hi, Andy, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast, and welcome back to the Salesman Podcast.
Welcome back. Thank you very much for having me back, Will. We should do this more often.
You are more than welcome, and open invitation. Genuinely, you are more than welcome back on.
Thank you.
Whenever we've got opportunity, the time to get it on our schedules. And today I want to talk about the process of maximizing the value of every sales touch that we have with a prospect. And to get us started, because this we could go super deep, super quick with this topic, I'm sure. But to start at the very basics, what do you define as a sales touch?
It's anything. And anytime you're consuming some of the customer's time, that's a sales touch.
And I want to just dive into that a bit deeper
Sure.
on the offset of, is that proactive and retroactive? And what I mean by that is you could curate some great content. You could, write this beautiful email. Do you define a sales touch perhaps as touches that actually they get and spend time with, or is it just all of the above?
Yeah, for me, it's really all of the above, right? Because anytime that you could be sending an email, you could be calling, leaving a voicemail, a call. Yeah, anytime that you're interacting with them, or they have to interact with what you've sent them, they're investing some of their time. And so the question is, are they getting an ROI on that time that they're investing? And I talk about this in both my books. I coined this phrase called return on time invested. Are they getting a return on the time they've invested in you? And so you really have to be conscious, and this requires a level of deliberate selling that is elusive for many sales reps, because they aren't that deliberate, and they really need to be, right? They have to be conscious. Every time I'm doing something that requires the customer to interact with it, what am I providing that's of value to them, that's helping them move closer to making a decision?
And can you have a negative value touch point to make up a phrase?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the perfect example is the check-in call, right? Salespeople hate a vacuum, and so if they haven't heard from a prospect for a week or two, and they thought they had some momentum, and I talk about this when I talk to live groups. People say, "Raise your hand if you've ever made a check-in call," and only about half the people raise their hands. I say, well, okay, now we know who are the truth tellers and who aren't, because let me guarantee you've all made check-in calls. And so if you call the prospect and you're just trying to touch bases and hey, Mr. Prospect, this is Andy. Yeah, I know we haven't talked in a couple weeks, but I just wanted to check in, see how things are going. What are they getting out of that? They invested some of their time in you. What are they getting in return? And they're getting nothing. Well, if you start training them in the negative, as you talked about, then they're going to stop giving you their time.
So is there a balance then, or is it fair to say that perhaps less touches can be better? Or
Absolutely.
Absolutely. From that then, because I wasn't sure which way you'd go with that. Is it less touches are better, or is it you just got to spend more time on the touches that are in place, if that makes sense?
Well, ideally fewer are better. Right, it's not the goal of the customer to spend more time with you. It's the goal of the customer to get their job done, spending the least amount of time possible with you. And so your process and your interactions really need to align with that requirement of the customers. And
Because
it
that
really,
seems, let me interrupt you there, because that seems
sure.
kind of paradoxical of you want to build more rapport, you want to build better relationships. It seems on the surface that you want to spend more and more time and get more engagements and go deeper with the customer. But should we be framing, and a lot of people come on the show and talk about that as well, should we be framing this the other way around of what is the minimum amount of, not time and effort, but the minimum amount of disruption to the prospect to close a deal, perhaps? Is that a better way of looking at it?
No, I wouldn't put it in the sense of disruption because as a salesperson, you're providing a service. First and foremost, you're providing a service to the prospect. And if you don't understand that, then you need to sit back for a second and think about that, right? Because the customer is trying to achieve a goal, which is to evaluate a product and a service and make a decision on it. And your sole job in life is to help them make that decision. So, it requires that you have a certain level of credibility, a certain rapport with them. But that rapport, and there's been studies on this that, the Gallup group did it, where, they've studied salespeople for decades and sales interactions. What they found is that salespeople put more stock in the relationship with the prospect than the prospect put into the relationship with the customer, the salesperson. And, part of that is the customer doesn't want to be friends. They don't want to be buddies. They don't want you to take them to lunch. They do want to like you. There's the know, like, and trust. But that like, it doesn't mean a deep personal relationship where we're sending Christmas cards to each other. It means they like you enough to keep talking to you and to really open the door for you to develop that trust-based relationship, which is that final step. So the relationship with a prospect is really about helping them get their job done. What are you doing for them? It's outcome-based, really from the beginning. If you can't give them something of value, which could be a great discovery question, it could be an insight, it could be data, it could be a case study. Value comes in many forms. So if you can't give them something of value every time you interact with them that help them, like I said, move one step closer. No, it could be a very small step, but move one step closer to the decision. Why are you doing it?
Is this something that you see a lot of salespeople get wrong? Because literally last week I did 2 episodes of the show where they were talking about deep, complex B2B sales over the longer term, and the account management rather than closing a fresh deal kind of thing. But and this is relatively novel, it makes total sense, but it's relatively novel to me. Do you find that salespeople get this wrong, where they are regularly over-investing in their prospects, and their prospects are kind of going, well, you've done your bit now, get off the phone?
Well, I wouldn't call it over-investing, I'd call it misinvesting.
Okay.
Right? So they think there's some value in just randomly reaching out to the prospect, and there's not. It doesn't help. It doesn't help anybody. And so it's like, why do you do it? It's why I counsel people, don't do it. And it's equally as important in large, complex deals. I spent 15 years selling large, multi-million-dollar communication systems to some of the largest companies in the world. So I get this as well as anybody. It is as important in those deals to be very respectful of the prospect's time. And, there's some school of thought that some people have that, you're in these complex deals and you can have lots of small touches sort of add up to the value of one big touch. And that's rarely the case.
I find this really fascinating, Andy, and I want to dive into it deeper on the
Sure.
context of, should these touches then start small and ramp up? Should they begin more frequent, I guess less frequent? Is there a framework to this to achieve that outcome-based goal that we set at the very beginning?
We have processes, right? We have sales processes. We define sales stages. In account-based selling, there's a lot of focus on, okay, what are the exit criteria for each stage, and are you meeting those exit criteria for the prospects, and so on. So you can get in a complex sale, you can get very detailed on that.
But less about that, more the touches themselves, as if there was a process for the touches of, it seems that you'd have lots of smaller ones at the beginning, and at the end you'd be wanting to just, everyone knows who you are, you've developed, they know, like, and trust you, you developed that trust. So at the end, is it then better to give big drops of value, less frequently, if that makes sense?
No. And here's why. So there's multiple reasons. I'll start with one and lead to the other. Is there's this economist named Daniel Kahneman, who's written extensively, Nobel Prize winner, written extensively about how people make decisions. And one of the formulations that he's well known for is called the peak end rule. And the peak end rule says that when people go through an experience and they look back at it in order to formulate a decision, that basically they only remember two things, or only take into account two primary factors in decision making, which is the peak event in that process and the last contact. And so if you put that into the context of a sales process, and I talk about this extensively in my most recent book, Amp Up Your Sales, is that, I sort of graph out a sample or nominal sales process on an XY axis. And in the minds of most salespeople, it is this, we build momentum with these smaller touches and we go and we finish at the end. Well, but what Kahneman says is, look, you can't predict in advance what's going to be the peak experience. It could be, for instance, we have this sort of epidemic of poor sales lead follow-up. So let's assume this is a prospect that was initiated through an inbound sales lead. Well, if you were the only one that followed up with them within the first 24 hours of getting the lead, that could be the peak experience. Based on that interaction, they could form the perception of you. Because again, selling is the whole expression is, people make emotional decisions for logical reasons, right? So your job as a salesperson is, how do I use sort of my intangibles to build this emotional capital with the customer, where I win that emotional battle? You do that up front with value, with peak experiences. So for me, I want to front load my value as much as I can. I want to be incredibly responsive to them. I want to be respectful of their time. I want to help them make as much progress into the early part of their buying process as I can, because I know then, I talk about this, and actually it's a talk I'm giving a lot these days in public forums, is what I call, enables me to win the sale before I win the order. I'm going to get that emotional commitment from the prospect based on what I do in the early stages, that they want to do business with me, and everybody else at that point is fighting for second place.
Okay, I want to touch on that in a minute, but I want to focus and narrow down on this. Should we be then trying to create and manufacture a peak event? And what I mean by that is, perhaps you're the first to respond, but then should you, and where I'm going with this is, we've only got so much time in the day, we've only got so many resources. Should we be putting 80% of our time into creating one big peak experience that they take a lot of value out of, rather than, and consciously doing that and targeting it and building it, whatever it is, rather than following up regularly and doing everything constantly, and having a bit more of a flat approach, which is what I think with CRM software that reminds you to email 2 weeks later and you send a stupid email that no one reads. That's kind of where sales has gone and is going, rather than these big emotional events that take a lot of prep work and have more risk to them as well, perhaps.
Right. And no, I don't think you prepare for the big events. I think what you do is, not to use necessarily a purely sort of an American saying, but you have to bring your A game every single call. So if you're,
sounds like really hard work, though. I think subconsciously that's what I'm trying to get out of.
No, it's not hard work. It requires thought. That's all it requires, right? Is every time you have a chance to interact with a prospect, you have a choice about how you're going to do it. And so, is it hard work to be responsive? Absolutely not. In fact, it's directly under your control as a salesperson. That's the things that I want people to focus on, is what are the elements that you control as a sales rep, and master those. You can't control product, you can't control price, you can't control features, but you can control your responsiveness, you can control your product knowledge, you can control how knowledgeable you are about the customer and their business. Those things, you master those things, and you're thoughtful and deliberate about every time you have the opportunity to engage with that prospect. Okay, what is it, the value that I'm going to deliver in this call, and what do I want them to do as a result of having received it? If you can answer that question before every touch with a prospect, you're way ahead of the game. And the prospect could be way ahead of their game as well.
How does this fit in? And I feel like I might make you a bit angry with this, Andy. But how does this fit in with, not really, but how does this fit in with the trends of like social selling and liking your prospects' posts and leaving thoughtful comments for them? Because you're not really getting any action from it. And it's kind of I see it as a bit of just a cheap move, really.
Yeah, based on your recent post about social selling is BS. Yeah. It's like table stakes to a certain degree, right? I mean, you're trying to set yourself apart. And that's to me, that's the value of social selling, right? Is how do you set yourself apart so that when you have that opportunity to engage, the prospect will be more open to it. But in terms of actual selling, I don't think there's a lot of actual selling that takes place in social selling. It's about opening the doors for engagement and having those conversations. And it's worth doing some investment. We both do it. You do it. I do it. I mean, in the promotion of our podcast and so on, we're doing social selling. So it's not like it's totally without value, but it is very indirect. And I think that what I talk about is, with responsiveness and value creation is that is, when you're that face to face with this person, what happens in that point? And that's really the decisive point for salespeople.
Okay, the final one on this, Andy, and this should hopefully wrap up this part of the show. When do you stop touching and adding value to your prospects? Is there it clearly depends on the industry and all that, but is there a point where you just say, hey, I've had my commission check, they've got their product, they're not going to be buying anything for years and years, I should stop sending them these, hi, just checking in emails, or is it worth it some way keeping in touch?
It's absolutely worth keeping in touch. So part of it depends on the nature of the product and service you're selling. So you're seeing, like in the SaaS industry, where part of the increased specialization of the sales role is they've specialized now in these customer success roles, account management roles, who their job is really to take over from the account exec once the deal's closed, or at some transition point within 6 months after closing the deal, where they have the responsibility to do discovery on ongoing requirements and so on. Absent that environment, which is where most people still are in the less specialized sales forces, and I talk about this in, again, my most recent book, I talk about what I call the most important sales call you can make. And to me, that is the first call you make on your prospect after they give you an order. So once they become a customer and they give you an order, before you've even implemented or delivered the service, is you need to call them and go back through sort of the process, recap. This is why you contacted us. This is what your requirements were. This is why we bid what we did. This is what you bought. This is what we're going to deliver, and this is what's going to do. And reset the expectations. Because what happens is that if you're in a competitive sales situation, I guarantee you that when the customer gives you the order, what they think they're ordering is the best of what you proposed and your competitors proposed, because they conflate it all into one. And so it's really important, as sort of the first step is, after you get that order, is to pick up the phone and call them, or go meet with them, or whatever works, and just review again what it is, what they were trying to accomplish, what their needs were, why you bid what you bid, why they bought from you, what you're delivering. And then after that, if you are both the account exec and the account manager, is you have to have a plan for what it is that you're going to do for the next steps to help sort of uncover additional requirements they might have. It's part of an ongoing sales process. And it really sort of almost like resets the clock with them. Except it's easier, right? Because you've already passed the know, like, and trust barrier.
And just to give us a bit of context here and an example of what is a touch point after this, perhaps another, you've delivered on the product, everyone's happy, the relationship's there, they know they can trust you, but what's a touch point after that?
Well, I mean, part of it is several ways that it can go, right? I mean, one is you're trying to really understand how they're going to use your product and service, because it's not always completely the same based on what you bid versus what they're actually using it for and deriving value from. And understanding that, and make sure you understand what the people who have responsibility for using it and responsibility, let's say, at a P&L basis for your product and service, is understand if they're getting the value from it that you proposed, understanding really what that is, and then starting a conversation about, okay, well, are there other places within the organization that could benefit from this as well? Or are there other individuals that could utilize this, additional seats to a service you're selling or whatever? But start those conversations, reasonably early, because customer's not naive. They know that if you sell a product or a service that, let's say as a SaaS product, and you start with 10 seats and there's 100 available seats, they know what your goal is. And you probably started with 10 just to do a proof of concept, right? So it's not going to be a mystery. So if you're the same person, you just have to think about, I'm starting this discovery process over again. And you really have to think about it from that perspective and not go in with it thinking, okay, I know exactly what they want because I sold them this thing. Things change. You go back in with an open mind, listen without judgment to what it is, that the value that we talked about, and then ask the right questions to help discover other additional needs.
Amazing stuff. Andy, last time you came on the show, I asked you a question to ask everybody, and I'm going to put a slight twist on it today, seeing as you come back on, and I'm going to have to retwist this question every time you come back on in the future. If you could sit down with the audience one-on-one, of course, it would never physically be possible to do.
Right.
But if you could, what would be the one overarching piece of advice you'd give to every sales professional listening to the Salesman Podcast right now?
It's the point I'd made before, is master the elements of the sales process that are under your control. So for me, the big one I said is responsiveness. It seems so self-evident that we should be responsive to our prospects and our customers, but it doesn't happen. And so, master responsiveness, master your product in terms of product knowledge and how it's applied, master your customers. No one's stopping you from doing this. And if you do this is things that you control, you're going to set yourself apart from people within your company and also your competitors in the mind's eye of the customer. So work on things you control. And if you do that, you're in great shape.
What percentage of sales success comes down to replying promptly, knowing your product knowledge, knowing your competitors, and then being an interesting person who gets along with people? And you can develop that if you're perhaps an introvert and you don't like getting in touch and being in front of people. It's definitely not something people are born with, and it's exclusive. But those three things, forgetting, building rapport, and NLP, and all these like really interesting topics that we all love talking about, how much of sales success is just down to the core basics?
Oh, I think most of it, right? I think the ability to ask great questions, to be responsive, to ask great questions, to listen to the responses, and listen without, I used the phrase before, listen without judgment. So take your bias filters off. And if you can do that, that goes such a long way. And I had on my show, I'd interviewed Mark Roberge from HubSpot. And he talked about a drill that he does to practice this himself, where he goes to social events, and when he meets a new person, he sort of tries to see how long he can go without having to say anything about himself, and without being annoying, right? But I mean, just being interested in the person, asking questions, and learning all they can about that person. And if you can do that as a sales rep, that is a huge, great skill. It doesn't require you to be extrovert. In fact, actually, introverts probably have an advantage in this, because they're going to be less about me, and more about you, the other person. So make as much as you can about the other person, and that goes a long way. It's that 30%, 40%. It's all part of a package, and everybody's sort of individual. I'm sort of an introvert and have been. It may not seem like it, but most of my life. And for me, the way I broke the barrier with customers, sort of this initial building rapport, was questions first and foremost, and trying to be sort of authentic to who I was. I like to kid people. So for me, it was always sort of successful to sort of kid people a little bit, sort of break the barrier, sort of put them at ease. And it's just something that worked for me. We could sort of find something we could make a joke about, and sort of was a good icebreaker. But then, show a real interest in the prospect, and and I stress that, a real interest in the prospect.
Yeah, I think that empathy and the emotional intelligence and the things that they're the things that I've noticed in the salespeople that I've worked with who have been far and away the best in the team. I've always been top 10, top 20. I've never excelled to that top 1%. I think in hindsight, in my medical advisory jobs, I could have put in a lot more work, a lot more hours, a lot more hustle, and I probably would have done better from it. But I guess you only know that with hindsight. And I totally agree with you. I feel that the basics are the most important thing, and it's something I'm going to be focusing on in future podcast episodes as well. And with that, Andy, I really enjoyed this episode, mate. And for everyone who's listening who's enjoyed it as well and enjoyed your conversation, tell us a little bit about your podcast, Accelerate, and, of course, where we can find it as well.
Oh, sure. So thank you very much. So I enjoyed being on the show. My podcast is called Accelerate, and it's 6 days a week currently. And, we do a similar format to you, a 30-minute, 35-minute interview format. Get people from sales, marketing, management, leadership, but look at everything sort of through a sales filter. And you can find me at my website, andypaul.com, or on iTunes. It's Accelerate with an exclamation mark. Stitcher, most of the major podcast directories, you can find it there. And if you want to contact me, reach out, Andy at zerotimeselling.com, and I'd love to connect with you.
Amazing stuff. We'll link to all that in the show notes over at salesman.red.
Thank you.
And with that, Andy, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights, because there's a couple of things here that I wasn't sure on, and you've cleared them up for me for certain. So I appreciate that. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me again. And for people listening, you're going to be on my show here soon too. So look forward to that.
And there we have it. Andy, thank you for coming on the show. I massively appreciate it, mate. Thank you, Sales Nation, as always, for tuning in. Thank you for your time and attention, whether you're listening to this on iTunes, Android, as you're driving around, or whether you're watching this on YouTube. And I'm waving as I say that for everyone who is. And I'll speak with you all again tomorrow.